All right, so the point of today is to provide you guys with an option to differentiate instruction. So we've already gone through, we reviewed the content that we focused on yesterday when we were learning the content, the periodic trends and whatnot, and now you have a choice, okay? So what I need you guys to do then is I want you guys to look at each of these three lessons and then think about what your preferred learning style is, all right? So if you think that you learn best through like math and creating graphs and analyzing data tables, then you're going to choose lesson number 1. If you think that you learn best by like listening to somebody tell a story or hearing a story that represents the content, then you're going to choose lesson number 2. And then if you are better at working with like hands-on manipulatives, or visual representations help you learn, then you're going to choose lesson number 3. All right. So if you choose the logical and mathematical multiple intelligence lesson, then you're going to go back here. If you choose the interpersonal one, then I'm going to keep you guys seated up in your desk here. And then the visual spatial students are going to head on back to this back corner here. All right. And if I were administering, so the idea of this is that you guys learn content, and then which is like the process of learning it, and then now we're undergoing the process of practicing content. All right. So now we're going to take the content that we learned regarding the periodic trends, we're going to practice it, and really what we're trying to do is practice it in a situation where your needs or your strengths are capitalized on, and then hopefully that will build retention, create a better mental model for you to use when we come to assessment time. All right. The ultimate goal when you're done with one of these 3 lessons is to be able to answer the following questions. So again, I want you to be able to use periodic trends, so the stuff that we learned about yesterday, ionization energy, electronegativity, to describe why lithium works in treating people who suffer from bipolar disorder. All right. There's a bunch of ways you can answer this. You can illustrate a picture. You can write a paragraph. However you feel comfortable. If there's another way that you want to answer that question, just let me know. So, if I were to, the idea behind like this differentiated lesson is that you guys would come in early. One of your pre-assessment models would be to come in and figure out where your strengths are in terms of these multiple intelligences and where your weaknesses lie. And then the idea is that we capitalize on your strengths, and then we try to nurture those areas that you're deficient in, because everybody kind of is going to be different based on their history, kind of their upbringing, what was focused on when you were growing up in other areas of school. And so we're not going to do that because we don't have time to administer that survey and whatnot. So I just want you to simply take a second to think about, how do I learn best, and then make that decision for yourself. All right. So we'll take a couple minutes, talk to each other, and then you guys can go back and get into the different sections. All right. Any questions? And then Sean here is working with the visual and spatial representation, and he is working on a virtual lab where he is sending electrical signals down, and he is observing potassium and sodium flooding a system. When he's done with that, he's going to go over and watch a YouTube video, which it looks like he has up. Would you show him that one, Sean? And he's going to look at the reactivity of metals as you move down a periodic table. And so this is just kind of a fun YouTube video where people throw sodium and potassium into water, and you see big explosions depending on the reactivity of the metal. Alright, so these students over here are performing Radiolab podcasts. So they are listening to a Radiolab podcast from about this girl named Jessie who suffers from bipolar disorder, and then they are answering analysis questions that pertain to the podcast. All right, so here we have students that are working on the logical and mathematics lesson, and so they are performing a reaction between magnesium and calcium, and you can see that the calcium is reacting pretty vigorously, whereas the magnesium is reacting, but it's not reacting nearly as vigorously as the calcium is. And so what the students are doing then is they are measuring
temperature using Vernier lab sensors, and they are documenting that on their data sheet here. So they are just wrapping up with collecting data. They have some qualitative observations, and then they're going to analyze the data using a graphical analysis component on the back. Alright, so here we have students that are working on the logical and mathematics lesson, and so they are performing a reaction between magnesium and calcium, and you can see that the calcium is reacting pretty vigorously, whereas the magnesium is reacting, but it's not reacting nearly as vigorously as the calcium is. And so what the students are doing then is they are measuring temperature using Vernier lab sensors, and they are documenting that on their data sheet here. So they are just wrapping up with collecting data. They have some qualitative observations, and then they're going to analyze the data using a graphical analysis component on the back.
So now that we are through with the 3 different lessons, we're going to go around and I want somebody from each section to talk about what they experienced and kind of what their lesson was like. Tell me what you did back there, tell me what you observed, and then from there I want you to read your answer to the final question. Okay, so for example, I'm going to model what the visual and spatial students did. And so Sean was back working on the visual and spatial lesson. And what Sean did is he looked at a virtual lab. What he did is he had a neuron, and so he was manipulating that neuron and sending electricity through it and looking at how the sodium and potassium ions would flood the membrane and then pass that signal on. Then after that, what he did is he watched a YouTube video of the one that I showed you guys earlier in Chem 1 of Group 1 metals as they react, and so the lithium, sodium, potassium, rubidium, cesium, and francium, showing how they get more and more reactive as you move down a group here, all right? And then the idea was that after watching that video, he would definitely see that sodium and potassium was more reactive, and so because that is the most common ion that's present in our nervous system, if you consume excess amounts of lithium, then the lithium will actually go in and replace sodium and potassium, and because it's less reactive, it slows down that electrical signal that passes through the system, all right? So we'll have somebody from the mathematical and logical lesson answer, just describe what you saw. So Mallory's going to do that.
Our experiment was to see between calcium and so by that we looked at the periodic table and noticed that lithium has a higher radius is less reactive. So it replaces sodium and potassium, slowing the electric.
Perfect. And then the interpersonal students that listen to the podcast. So Maria's going to share her experience. So tell us about Jamie and her story. It was kind of a strange one, right?
Yeah, so she has bipolar disorder and they decided to take her to the doctor. The doctor puts her on lithium, which calms her down and helps fight bipolar. But after a year or so taking lithium, it actually hurt her kidneys.
Yeah.
So there's benefits and
Yeah.
non-benefits.
Right. Yeah, and that story was really crazy. One thing that I found interesting is that like in the podcast they talk about water sources, and like there's like towns in Texas and other countries that have really small amounts of lithium in the water, and the rate of violent crimes are lower, like terrible things like thefts, rape, all that terrible stuff is the percent of that happening is much lower in those countries just simply because that was used in water. Alright? Are we good here? Alright. We did it!
Gotten home and I've been able to look at the results of the lesson. I think overall that it was a successful lesson. The objective of the lesson was to get students to be able to use periodic trends, so patterns that exist within the periodic table, to describe why lithium is an effective drug for treating people who suffer from bipolar disorder. The students all were able to answer that question within their given worksheet. Each of the 3 worksheets asked that question at the end of the lesson, and each student within the class was able to answer that question. Students before this lesson were they were given direct instruction the day before the lesson, and then asked to answer some questions that related to the chemical reactivity of various elements as they exist on the periodic table, and then as well as identify the difference in periodic trends for metals and nonmetals between the ionization energy and electronegativity. The students were very receptive to this lesson. They were excited to see the type of lesson, and when I surveyed them at the end of the lesson, I had a lot of positive feedback from the students. I think that the concept of choice, or the idea of giving the students a choice in the lesson, made a big difference in overall engagement from the students. The only problem I had in the lesson itself was a student did miss the direct instruction, and while I posted a lecture online for any students that missed when the student came into my classroom, they hadn't gone through that lesson, and so it was hard for them to be able to engage with the students who were then going on and applying the practice component of the unit. That student who did miss the day, what I had them do, because I was trying to administer 3 different lessons, I had them watch that lecture that I posted online and then complete the worksheet where they were supposed to, where they were supposed to identify the difference in reactivity and whatnot. That student then missed out on that differentiated instruction. The problem that I experienced with the differentiated instruction is there was only 2 of those 3 lessons that students could perform outside of the class. So I anticipate that being a problem down the line if I were to continue on with this. But overall, it was a positive experience. I've asked students what they thought about the lesson, and if they thought that I should keep it in the unit, or if I should perform more of a traditional sequenced unit where students go from one lesson to another, and they really did like having the choice to engage in their preferred learning style. So overall, it was a positive experience. I think students were pleased with it, and the objective of the lesson was met. So it'll be interesting to see how retention relates to the lesson. The students will have their unit assessment a week from today, actually, so I'll be curious to see how the results are for that, as well as at the end of the year when I ask students to reflect back on periodic trends. I do have a question in their final exam review where I ask them to use periodic trends to describe why lithium is an effective drug for treating people who suffer from bipolar disorder. So again, I'm looking forward to seeing how students retain this information. I don't have any quantified data that supports whether students are or are not retaining the data, but I do, just from my own observations, I have experienced students who have come back and given me feedback that they have remembered that podcast, and but again, I don't know if that's just because that is their preferred learning style, or if the sequence that I've laid out traditionally is something that facilitates retention.